Welcome back to the show now, 29 minutes before the top of the hour. And as promised, joining us via phone line to talk about all things IU football and basketball, Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier. Mike, good morning to you, sir.
Gentlemen, how are you guys doing?
We're doing very well, and of course, we're pleased to have Mike on each and every Monday at 8:30 a.m. here telling us all about and getting us excited about not just what happened over the weekend, but the games ahead. And of course, we're going to be convening on a part that's really going to be a lot of fun here coming up in just a few weeks, as we're going to have college football, the Big Ten in full swing, probably at the midway point of their season, and then plus we'll be able to talk about college basketball. First thing, let's talk about a big win on the when you take on a Rutgers team. And, of course, this is an IU team that finds himself not in the top 25. They're in the top 20 right now. Mike, what is it right now, the kind of, I don't know if you want to call it euphoria at this point, but what's it feel like right now when you wear your IU football hoodie out these days?
I think cautious optimism might be the best way to describe it.
That's good.
I mean, look, there's a major reality check coming in this weekend against Michigan, and I know we'll get to that. But I think that there's a certain reality that that you're right. They're ranked number 13 in both polls coming out of the weekend. But you look at the line for this weekend's game, and Michigan's a 2-point favorite, although Michigan's ranked 25th in both polls. So there's a certain reality that when you kind of put your money where your mouth is, you recognize that, polls are one thing, 2-0 is one thing, but you got to win some of these games. And, of course, they did it against Penn State. But, the game this past weekend, Rutgers, I think I would refer to it as taking care of business. I think Indiana was expected to win by double digits. They did just that. It wasn't a perfect performance. It's never going to be, but I think they took care of business. Going into the game, I thought that they had an advantage with their front seven going against Rutgers' offensive line. I think that proved out. They created a lot of splash plays with the defense that ultimately turned the tide of the game, and they took care of the job. I think people underestimate Rutgers a little bit, but I think they're a completely different team, a program on the rise under a well-respected coach in Greg Schiano. And I think, I think Indiana did what they had to do. And then you start to look forward and say, okay, now you beat Penn State. Can you do it again and beat a program in Michigan that you haven't beaten since 1987?
You're going to have to do it, in this case, with a guy that is starting to play consistent football, and he really started that maybe the last drive of the fourth quarter. Of course, we're talking about Michael Penix Jr., as the young man went for 17 of 26, 238 yards, 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, a QBR rating of 71.9. Is this the Michael Penix Jr. we've been waiting to see?
Yeah, I think it is. And lost in that 17 of 26 is at least 5, maybe 6, depending on how you want to interpret it, drops. Mm-hmm. Mostly at the early part of that game. I mean, he was very efficient, very accurate. There were still some struggles with the O-line. Penix took quite a few hits, especially early in the game. But as that game on Saturday progressed against Rutgers, I think you saw Penix back to the form that we saw last year. His arm talent is just unquestionable. He puts the ball, in a good spot and then gets it there. He can make every throw on the field. And so, yeah, I think, and he also had a big run early in the game. I think it was the longest run of his career, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 yards, which I think is going to have to be a point of emphasis because I think teams are going to try to get him on the move because I think Indiana showed a little bit of reluctance against Penn State to get him out there and have him take hits, but I think it's just going to be part of it. So I think, yeah, to answer your question, I think that's more of the Penix that we thought we would see. I think it was fair to expect that there was going to be some rust in that first game against Penn State. He hadn't played a football game in over a full calendar year after having surgery, and he had an unusual offseason like everybody did. So, there was no rhythm or timing or anything with his receivers and playing against a good team like Penn State. So I think he took a big step forward against Rutgers, and now he's going to have to do it again against a really good defense that I think Indiana last year when they played Michigan, Penix didn't play in the game because he was already out for the year, but Indiana's offensive line got beat up Peyton Ramsey was the quarterback at the time. He took a lot of hits, a lot of sacks. So Penix is going to be really tested. And so was Penix the guy we thought he was going to be against Rutgers? Yeah, but the real test is going to come against a team like Michigan now that he's into his third game and has a little bit of a rhythm. Can he keep it going against a top-tier team like that?
The Hoosiers have always been predominantly a really strong rushing team. And again, that was kind of the calling card of the Big Ten for many, many years. But talk about this team's 2020 receiving core. It's pretty good when they got a couple of really nice names at the top of the list.
Yeah, it is, and they're actually dealing with some injuries right now. So there's not a lot of depth in the unit, but at the very top, as you alluded to, you got Whop Phillier, who is an all Big Ten caliber guy. Had 70 catches, over 1,000 yards last year, and he had a nice game, 137 yards, I believe, on Saturday. I think he's like the go-to for Penix. They put up some incredible numbers when they're on the field at the same time. And then, Ty Freifogel's a senior. He's been with the program a long time. He's really reliable. And so I think the combination of those two gives you a lot of experience. And the question is who's going to step up behind them. And they've already encountered issues there. Miles Marshall is kind of the third starter at wide receiver, and he had a concussion against Penn State and missed the Rutgers game. So you expect him to be back, hopefully, for Michigan. And, beyond those guys, it's a lot of youth. Javon Swinton's a true freshman that's had catches in both games so far. Jacoby Hewitt is a guy that made his first career catch against Penn State and is continuing to play. And then the other guy that kind of lost in the shuffle that had a big true freshman season last year, David Ellis, has missed both of the first two games. He'll probably be back against Michigan as well. So I think Penix should have more weapons this weekend, which can only help, because he didn't really distribute the ball that much against Rutgers. It was really just Freifogel, Phillier, and tight end Peyton Hendershot, who I didn't mention, but is another favorite target and a big part of the offense.
Talk about the play of Reese Taylor, Tywan Mullen, and Jamar Johnson, as that defense has probably gave up maybe a couple of touchdowns more than they anticipated this past weekend. But like you said, guys like this are going to have to come up big when they host Michigan next Saturday. Yeah,
they're kind of the unheralded part of the team right now, especially Jamar Johnson. I mean, people in Indiana know Reese Taylor because he's an Indianapolis kid, and then Tywan Mullen, had a huge true freshman year last year, and so everybody knows those two. But Jamar Johnson is just week in and week out, he makes plays. He had 3 interceptions for 3 games in a row going into last week. That streak got broke, but he still made some big plays, had a sack, and made some plays. Jalen Williams is a fourth guy in the secondary that continues to make plays. He got his second interception of the season. But they're big play guys. They're tough, physical corners. Mullen had 3 sacks. How often do you see a corner have 3 sacks in a game? Mm-hmm. And they find a way to make an impact. I think the defensive line is doing a good job occupying blockers and allowing Indiana's playmakers in the linebacking core in the secondary to make an impact so far. And they've done that with 6 takeaways, as you alluded to, really driven by the secondary.
I don't know how you look at the Big Ten standings, but when you look up there this morning, Mike, you're not going to see this very often, but Indiana, and let's just say it may or may not be because of alphabetical order, stands atop the Big Ten ahead of Ohio State at 2-0. First time we've probably seen that in a long time, if ever.
Yeah, that's one of my running jokes. Year in and year out, before Big Ten play actually starts, you always see Indiana right there at the top in the standings. But hey, this year, 2 games in, that's continued to hold serve, and it's actually their first 2-0 start in the league since 1991, which is just an amazing stat. You'd think that a couple easier league games would have lined up at some point along the way to allow them to do that. But be that as it may, you've got Michigan, you've got Ohio State coming up here, so there's no weeks off, especially with teams like Rutgers and Maryland playing well. So, getting there and staying there are 2 different parts of the conversation here.
Trace?
Yeah, I saw that Indiana had the biggest margin of victory this weekend in the Big Ten with 16 points. over Rutgers. And then I looked a little closer and said Rutgers had 3 turnovers, and I think gave Indiana a really short field on a couple possessions for touchdowns. Do you think they're worthy of that number 1 then?
Number 1 spot in the league?
Yeah, in the league. Uh-huh.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, Michigan's a 2-point favorite. That feels fair to me. Indiana has not defeated them, and I know every year is different, but they've lost 24 in a row to Michigan. You got to prove it on the field. Penn State was one thing that I think an honest assessment of that game was that it was a little fluky, to put it lightly. I think they're right there with Michigan and Michigan State this year. I think they can definitely beat those teams, but I don't think any fair assessment says that they're at the level of Ohio State. I don't know how you can get there. So, no, I do not feel like they're at the very top, but are they an upper echelon Big Ten team? I think you can go there at this point.
Taking a look at the Wolverines roster, it's first-year quarterback Joe Milton right now leads the team with 525 yards. I don't think there's been, 4 other passes that's even been attempted by fellow Wolverines. What's going to be the focal point of the IU defense? What do they have to do to thwart this Wolverine rushing attack, or even passing attack for that matter?
Yeah, I haven't focused on them too much yet, but I know Michigan State got a lot of penetration, got a lot of pressure on Milton, made him make a lot of mistakes. It was kind of a tale of 2 games for him. He looked really good against Minnesota, but not so much against Michigan State. That outcome really surprised me. I guess it probably shouldn't in 2020. There's been a lot of upsets and strange games that people weren't expecting. But Michigan's offense just really could never get into any kind of rhythm against Michigan State, who I think is a really down program. So it ought to give Indiana confidence that Michigan is beatable this year.
You look at the schedule, Mike, and they played 2 games in the first 2 weeks, and the way this is set up due to the pandemic and the scheduling during this time, there's no open days. Do you think that will play a factor as we get deeper into that schedule? Because you're going to play, 5 weeks in a row when you take on Ohio State on the road.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, obviously we saw the impact with Wisconsin this week, the impact of not having any breaks. I mean, they effectively just lost the game for their season because there's no makeup date possible, because the what I would characterize as an early rush by the Big Ten to postpone the season when they did back in August. But it also raises the concern for me for Indiana specifically, because I think that they're a really competitive team at the top of their depth chart, but if you start getting into, injuries, which are just obviously inevitable, that's when I start to worry that, some of these other teams in the Big Ten, like a Michigan, like Ohio State, they get into their 2, 3, even 4 deep, and you're still talking about kids that are probably good enough to play for an IU and even start for an IU, whereas Indiana, you start peeling back a few layers, and it's just not the same as they are at the top. And so it's definitely a concern. There's not going to be any breaks to kind of rest bodies and have people ready on a week-to-week basis like you would in a normal season.
We're going to take a brief time out, come back with more with Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier. We're going to ask him a Notre Dame football question when we return. Keep it right here. It's the Tow and Tracy Show on 97.7 FM WREF. Welcome back to the show now. 13 minutes before the top of the hour, Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier joining us via phone line. And Mike, we're going to ask you a Notre Dame question here, and I think you kind of know where we're going with this, as it looks like Clemson will play again without Trevor Lawrence. Does that put a different type of pressure on the Fighting Irish to know they're playing without arguably one of the top players in the nation?
I don't know if it puts additional pressure on them. I mean, if I were coaching the team, I'd be concerned that they're going to maybe relax a little bit, because, I mean, you saw how Clemson struggled against Boston College.
Yes.
I mean, you want your guys, fully focused and ready to go. And Clemson, although they don't have their quarterback, they've got a lot of highly talented players that they're still going to be a really tough out, I would think, for Notre Dame. So I would be concerned that my guys would lose their chip on their shoulder and their focus a little bit for that game.
We're talking with, of course, Mike Schumann here this morning, and Mike, we've talked about the recruitment of Trey Kaufman in IU basketball for quite some time. Well, this comes to an unceremonious end last week, but not without a little bit of controversy. Just kind of give us your thoughts on the covering of Trey Kaufman and his recruiting here in 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to admit the final outcome caught me off guard. You know, I think it started to become apparent in the last week or so. But just thinking back about the whole big picture and his entire recruitment, it seemed like an IU lean, and maybe there was some bias built into that because Southern Indiana kids don't typically go to Purdue. You just don't see that. I can't even tell you the last time it's happened. Of course, down there in Sellersburg, you'll lose a kid from that area to a Kentucky or Louisville, understandably, but they don't typically head up to West Lafayette. So and just to be fully honest about it, it's a big loss for Indiana. That was a very significant recruitment for them. They were placing a heavy emphasis on the kid, and they've now got to kind of gather themselves and refocus. I think where they're turning now is a kid out of Memphis, Tennessee, Mason Miller, who's the son of former NBA star Mike Miller. If they can land him, I think that would significantly soften the blow because they're two players that play different skill sets but play the same position. Both top 100 kids. So if there's a silver lining and they can land Mason Miller, I think ultimately those will just be two guys that you watch their careers progress and see, who has the better career to ultimately decide how impactful this was. But sitting here now without any of that information, it's a big miss for Indiana. There's just no way around it.
Based on the information that we have, I guess all of us have compiled on IU basketball over the past calendar year, how competitive will the Hoosiers be if and when the season does fire up?
I think that they're a top half of the Big Ten team. That's about all I'm comfortable saying right now. I think there's some teams above them that I clearly think that they're going to have to prove that they can compete with, like a Wisconsin, an Illinois, a Michigan State. Those teams all brought back a lot of talent, but they've also proven that they can compete at the top, which Indiana has not done to this point with Archie Miller. So I think, I really like Indiana's roster. I like the idea that they're going to play more of a guard-oriented, hopefully a more up-tempo approach. But they've got to prove all that, and they've got to show that they can be a better perimeter shooting team, which has been a real handicap for the program under Miller.
And again, we've asked this question of many folks when we talk with our friend Nick Baumgart and other just IU fans here in the area. Is Archie at this point? Can you make an assessment right now? Is Archie the man for this job? Is this particular season? I don't think you're going to get too many programs are going to hold coaches and players too accountable just because of the situation that we're in right now. But is Archie the right guy moving forward? Is this going to be something that Indiana is going to continue to improve year to year?
I think that verdict is still out there. I mean, I think I've always looked at year 4 and year 5 of a tenure as the most critical years. Mm-hmm. We're entering year 4 here. I think there has been growth, but it's been small. There's not been any kind of overwhelming moment where the program turned a page under Miller. It's been very incremental. I think they would have made the NCAA tournament last year, but they were clearly a bubble team. So I think they have a lot to prove. I think looking at the roster this year, in looking at the the more independent national expectations for the team, they're the highest that they've been since he's been there. And so I think it's natural to put a lot of emphasis on this year, as you suggested. This is a strange year, and maybe it's not the right year to do it. But if the season starts on November 25th and we kind of continue on through March Madness, I think it's going to be close enough to a similar year that it could be make or break for him. If they play a full 27-game schedule and have an NCAA tournament and Indiana's not part of it, I think he's going to be on the hot seat. Whether or not anything would happen would be a different story. But on the other hand, if they have a really strong campaign and make a nice NCAA run, then it's all systems go.
There's about a dozen or more teams, and you mentioned hot seat. I think there's about a dozen, maybe 15 or so teams out there, and I would definitely include Kentucky into that mix, as well as North Carolina and programs of that nature, that you're on the hot seat the minute you sign that first contract and you have that first introductory press conference. And IU, like it or not, is definitely one of those places, and they expectations are always high. Get it done yesterday, and when's the next title going to come our way? So I think you're 100% right. I think the hot seat could come perhaps a little sooner than later, but I would agree right now. I think the jury is still out on that. I'm an Archie, definitely an Archie fan, and have been since his days back at Dayton, and I look for him to get things turned around. Hopefully, sometimes coaches and fan bases, they just can't get out of their own way. I hope that they get things straightened out there again sooner than later. And as always, Mike, we appreciate your time with us as always, and we look forward, because I'm calling the upset right now of talking about a victory over Michigan next Saturday.
Well, one way or another, I can't wait to talk to you guys about it.
Thanks, Mike. We appreciate it. As a matter of fact, while I'm thinking about it, if you will text us your email address, we will send today's show to you. Okay, bud?
All right, appreciate it.
Thank you so much. That is Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier. It's our pleasure to talk to him Monday mornings at about 8:30 a.m. He's going to give us all the information we need to make an informed decision about the IU Hoosiers, both on the gridiron and on the basketball court. You're actually smarter now than when we started today, Tracy, after listening to Mike.
I am a whole lot smarter.
Right?